Get out!
Revenge Files with Nora. File 16, Melissa. The spreadsheet didn't add up. Not by a rounding error, not by a timing difference, by $25,000. I stared at the numbers until my coffee went cold, running the same calculation 3 times before I let myself believe what I was seeing. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing through every possible explanation that didn't involve the word fraud. Someone had approved expenses that didn't exist, and that someone had a corner office on the 28th floor. My name is Melissa Blackwell. I spent 7 years as a senior financial analyst at Hartwell Capital Partners in Manhattan, and I thought I understood how corporate fraud worked. I'd read the case studies, passed the compliance certifications, flagged the occasional suspicious transaction, but nothing prepares you for the moment when the evidence points directly at the person who signs your performance reviews and controls your entire career trajectory. Here's what happened. The budget planning session was supposed to be routine. Every January, the division heads gathered on the 28th floor to present their forecasts, justify their headcount, and fight over resources like children dividing Halloween candy. I wasn't invited to the main meeting. Financial analysts never were. But I was responsible for preparing the reconciliation reports that would feed into the final presentation, which meant I saw every number before anyone else did. That's how I found the first discrepancy. Hidden among hundreds of line items in our division's expense records was a vendor I didn't recognize: Clearwater Advisory. The invoices were clean, the amounts reasonable, the approvals properly documented with timestamps and authorization codes. Everything looked legitimate until I tried to verify the work they had supposedly delivered. But there was no work. No deliverables, no contracts, no meeting notes, no email threads, no project files. Just invoices paid monthly with clockwork precision, each one approved by the same digital signature. Philip Davenport, division head. The man who had hired me 7 years ago, promoted me twice since, and told me repeatedly that I had a future in this industry if I kept my head down and did good work. I had trusted him completely, the way you trust the ground beneath your feet. I should have closed the file right then. That's what most people would have done. Flag it internally, mention it to compliance in passing, let the system handle it quietly behind closed doors. But I'd seen how the system handled things before. Carefully. Selectively, with an emphasis on protecting senior reputations over exposing uncomfortable truths that might damage the firm's image. That was the unspoken rule everyone understood but no one acknowledged. I have to admit that I couldn't resist my curiosity. As I kept digging, I started documenting what I found. If I was wrong, no one would ever know. If I was right, everything would change. The Tribeca neighborhood where I lived had changed dramatically since I'd moved there 4 years earlier. The old industrial buildings had been converted into luxury condos, the corner bodegas replaced by artisanal coffee shops, the working-class families displaced by young professionals like me who could afford the rising rents. It was the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business, which suited me perfectly. I'd chosen the area for its proximity to the financial district and its relative quiet compared to Midtown. Most evenings, I walked home along the Hudson River, watching the sun set behind Jersey City while I processed whatever complications the workday had delivered. That Thursday evening, the complications felt heavier than usual. I sat at my office table with the printouts spread in front of me, trying to understand what I was looking at. The fluorescent light hummed above me as I traced each line with my finger, hoping to find a mistake in my own calculations. The invoices from Clearwater Advisory totaled $25,000 for the current month alone. Multiply that across 12 months, and you had over $300,000 annually flowing to a vendor that provided nothing measurable in return. The first week of my investigation, I told myself I was being paranoid. These things happened in large organizations with complex vendor ecosystems. Not everything required investigation, and not every anomaly indicated fraud. Clearwater Advisory was probably a legitimate vendor that I'd missed during my normal reviews. Actually, I was hoping that would be the case, but the invoices in every file I opened told me otherwise. I pulled records from the past 18 months and found the same pattern repeated with mechanical consistency. According to the historical data, the vendor had been receiving payments for services no one could describe and no one could point to for nearly 4 years. Monthly charges in the same amounts within a few $100s. The total I could document with certainty exceeded $450,000, and at the bottom of every single approved workflow was the same signature. Philip Davenport, the same man who had shaken my hand at my interview and promised me a bright future. I walked to Philip's office on a Thursday afternoon, planning to ask a simple question about vendor classifications. Just to see how he'd react when I mentioned the name, whether his expression would shift or his voice would tighten. His assistant, Nina Volkov, looked up from her computer screen with the practiced patience of someone who fielded interruptions all day long. She'd been with Philip for over a decade and knew every detail of his schedule, his preferences, his moods. Some assistants were just gatekeepers. Nina was a vault. In all my years at the company, I had never seen her surprised by anything. "He's in a meeting," she said. "Can I take a message? I'm working on the budget reconciliation for the planning session. I have a question about one of our vendors that I couldn't find documentation for." Nina's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. A flicker of recognition, maybe, or warning. Which vendor? Clearwater Advisory. The pause lasted half a second too long. She typed something I couldn't see from where I stood, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "He'll get back to you when he has a moment." Her tone was polite, but the dismissal was unmistakable. Philip never did get back to me about that question. Instead, the next morning, I received an email reassigning me from budget reconciliation to a completely different project. Internal systems audit, a task that had nothing to do with vendor payments and everything to do with keeping me away from the financial records I'd been reviewing for the past 3 weeks. The reassignment came from Philip's email address, but was written in the formal, impersonal tone that suggested Nina had drafted it. Do you think that was a coincidence? Philip Davenport had earned a reputation as the kind of leader everyone would want to work for. He was approachable and understanding, crediting his team for successes and not holding them accountable for failures. He remembered birthdays, asked about his employees' family members by name, and preferred to eat lunch in common areas rather than shut himself in his office. Analysts who reported to him considered themselves lucky. Those who didn't report to him wished they did. He had mastered the art of making everyone feel valued while revealing nothing of himself. I had believed all of it for 7 years, because I was busy being grateful for his mentorship and guidance. How many other discrepancies had I overlooked in those 7 years? Or how many times had I not asked the questions that should have been asked about Philip? The doubt crept in slowly at first, then all at once. I found myself questioning every interaction we had ever had, searching for signs I should have noticed. My mother had spent 30 years working for a manufacturing company in Ohio, only to be laid off 6 months before she would have earned her pension. She was a loyal and careful employee, the kind who never made waves and never questioned decisions from above. When she came home after the meeting where they let her go, she looked 10 years older than she had that morning. I never forgot that. Her eyes had lost something that day, a kind of trust that never fully returned. I did everything I could to make sure that wouldn't happen to me. I had made that promise to myself. I wouldn't be caught off guard like my mother, used and discarded by the very system I had served throughout my career. Until all of this happened, I thought I had achieved that in 7 years. I thought Hartwell Capital had given me a good career, a solid foundation. Good salary, respected position, a clear path to senior management if I kept performing well. What could possibly go wrong? Everything was going according to plan and under my control. Everything I'd worked for since graduating was built on the foundation of this company and the relationships I'd developed here. Walking away from all of that felt impossible. But so did staying silent. This meant that exposing Philip meant risking all of it. Every promotion, every bonus, every professional connection I'd made. The financial industry was smaller than people realized. Word traveled fast, and people who caused problems for senior executives tended to find doors closing in front of them regardless of whether they'd been right or wrong. But I had learned something important. The SEC-TICS whistleblower program had been redesigned years ago to encourage exactly this kind of reporting. Financial professionals who exposed securities fraud could receive between 10 and 30% of sanctions exceeding $1 million. The program offered protection against retaliation and confidentiality throughout the investigation process. I'd learned about it during compliance training and promptly forgotten it, the way you forget about fire extinguisher locations until you smell smoke. It was time to refresh my knowledge. I read every word of the requirements 3 times, sitting in my kitchen at 2 in the morning with the city lights blinking through my window. Sleep was impossible. My brain refused to shut down. Then I started building my case properly. Documentation is evidence. That phrase had been drilled into me during my first compliance training, and I'd repeated it to junior analysts dozens of times since. But I realized I never truly understood what it meant. After spending 3 weeks gathering every piece of information I could find about Clearwater Advisory and its relationship to Hartwell Capital, I understood its true meaning. The company was registered in Delaware, which meant minimal disclosure requirements and maximum privacy protection. Standard practice for legitimate businesses and shell companies alike. But corporate registrations are public records, and public records leave traces for anyone patient enough to follow them. Clearwater Advisory had been formed 4 years ago by a single-member LLC with an address in New Jersey. The registered agent was a legal services company that specialized in anonymous incorporations. Dead end on paper, but the payments from Hartwell Capital went somewhere, and that somewhere had banking records that would eventually tell the whole story. I couldn't access those banking records directly, but I could access our internal audit trail, and that trail showed exactly when each payment was processed, which accounts it cleared through, and who had authorized every single transfer. Every single authorization carried Philip Davenport's digital signature. I printed the approvals, the invoices, the vendor registration documents, and the internal routing records. Then I cross-referenced payment dates against Philip's calendar, which Nina kept meticulously updated in the shared system. On 12 separate occasions, payments to Clearwater Advisory were processed while Philip was listed as being in client meetings that, according to our CRM system, never actually occurred. Ghost meetings covering ghost invoices. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence and too deliberate to be mistake. I started arriving early and staying late, using the quiet hours to pull additional records without attracting attention from colleagues who might ask uncomfortable questions. The compliance team had access to vendor verification databases that I technically wasn't authorized to use anymore, but my credentials from a previous project hadn't been revoked yet. In those databases, I found something that changed everything. Clearwater Advisory shared a registered agent with another company, Davenport Family Holdings LLC. Philip's surname, Philip's family, Philip's money. Was that an interesting coincidence too? But this connection wasn't proof of criminal intent by itself. However, it was enough to establish reasonable suspicion of embezzlement. Combined with the phantom invoices and fabricated meetings, it painted a picture that any competent federal investigator would recognize immediately. I had spent weeks hoping I was wrong. Now I knew I wasn't. I had bought a Samsung T7 Shield specifically for this purpose and started bringing it to the office every day. It was an encrypted portable drive, and even if someone found it, they couldn't access the data inside without my password. Maybe it sounds paranoid, but after completing my backup procedures each evening, I took it home and stored it in a place I considered safe. I changed the hiding spot twice during the first week, convinced that someone might be watching. That night, I couldn't sleep. The numbers kept running through my head like a song I couldn't stop hearing. $25,000 monthly. 18 months of detailed records I'd personally reviewed. Patterns extending back nearly 4 years based on the corporate filings. If the fraud had been running since Clearwater Advisory was formed, the total could exceed $1 million. Over $1 million stolen from a company that had given me every opportunity I'd ever wanted. I thought about Philip. The man who had championed my promotion, recommended me for special projects, told me I had a future in this industry. He'd been kind to me when kindness wasn't required. Supportive when support would have been easy to withhold. The kind of boss people described as a mentor in recommendation letters. He was also a thief. And he'd been stealing long before I arrived. It was like I was seeing two different characters. I still couldn't believe Philip was doing this, but this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a deliberate choice, practically his way of life. I finished that sleepless night with all these thoughts swirling in my head. The ceiling fan spun slowly above me, counting the hours until dawn. The next morning I was quite tired and couldn't think clearly, but I knew very well that I had to file a complaint with the SEC. The city looked different through my window. Everything was sharper, like someone had adjusted the contrast on everything I could see. The walk from my apartment to the subway took the same 12 minutes it always did, but the familiar streets felt foreign and charged with possibility. I felt like I had crossed into an unknown universe. There was a very clear and cold reality in front of me. I was about to become a whistleblower. The word carried weight I hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. Whistleblowers were heroes in news articles and villains in corporate cultures. They were praised publicly and punished privately, necessary and unwanted, principled and disruptive, right and ruined all at once. I wondered which category I would fall into when this was all over. Deciding not to overthink all of this, I made the necessary arrangements. I filed the complaint that afternoon, using a secure submission portal from a public library 3 blocks from my apartment. The SECTICS office of the whistleblower acknowledged receipt within 24 hours and assigned a case number that looked randomly generated but felt deeply personal. Then I waited. It was as if time was mocking me. Waiting turned into torture. Every email notification made my heart skip. Every glance from a colleague felt loaded with meaning. The investigation took 4 months to produce visible results. During that time, I continued working at Hartwell Capital, continued attending meetings with Philip, continued pretending that nothing had changed while everything was changing beneath the surface where no one could see it yet. Throughout those long 4 months, I tried to read meaning into people's glances, living with suspicion and anxiety. Philip never suspected me specifically during this time. Why would he? I was a financial analyst doing financial analysis, exactly what I'd been hired to do. The questions I'd asked about Clearwater Advisory had been forgotten or dismissed as routine curiosity from someone who took her job too seriously. He had no reason to connect me to the federal investigation that was quietly building around him. But he knew something was wrong. He didn't have his usual cheerfulness and self-confidence. Then I slowly began to notice some changes. Closed-door meetings that ran longer than usual. Phone calls he took in the hallway away from people instead of his office. A tightness in his voice during budget reviews that hadn't been there before, even when the numbers looked fine. The SEC had contacted Hartwell Capital's compliance department in February, requesting documents related to vendor relationships and expense approvals. Standard audit protocol, the company had been told, routine verification that happened periodically across the industry. Nina started looking at me differently after that request arrived, not with suspicion exactly, more like recognition. As if she was seeing something in my face that she'd been afraid to name for years. Women's intuition. One afternoon, she stopped me in the hallway near the coffee station. "You should be careful," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. Not everyone appreciates attention to detail. Though this cryptic conversation surprised me, I tried not to show it. I thanked her and walked back to my desk without asking what she meant. Apparently she already knew and was on my side. Or maybe she was bluffing and playing some kind of game with me. A week later, Philip found me in the break room. I was pouring my coffee with plenty of sugar. He entered the room with his usual great confidence and ease, and leaned against the counter. Though I tried not to show it, I had been distant toward him for a long time, and his sudden approach made me uncomfortable. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup, needing something to hold on to. "Melissa," he said, drawing out my name like we were old friends sharing a secret. "How's the systems audit treating you?" "Fine. Routine stuff." He nodded slowly, watching my face. "You know, I've been thinking about your career trajectory. You've been here 7 years now. That's a long time to stay at the same level." I set down my coffee cup and started stirring the sugar. "Is this a performance conversation? Just an observation?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Talented people sometimes get stuck because they focus on the wrong things, details that don't matter, questions that don't need answers. You understand what I mean? I think I do. He was looking directly into my eyes as if searching for an answer. Meanwhile, I was still stirring my coffee, avoiding his gaze. Why am I the one avoiding eye contact? I thought. He should be the one doing that. I felt embarrassed on his behalf. Have you ever had a similar experience? Then he straightened, adjusted his cuffs, and continued talking. Melissa, I'd hate to see you sabotage your own future over something that isn't worth the attention. Some vendors are complicated. Some expenses don't fit into neat categories. That's just how business works at this level. Suddenly, I raised my head and met his gaze. Is there something specific you want me to stop looking at? With that look, I had challenged him. At that point, he clearly knew. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled too tight. Then Philip laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the break room walls. The sound felt hollow, rehearsed, like he had practiced it in front of a mirror. You're direct. I've always liked that about you. Just remember that directness can be a liability as much as an asset. Choose your battles carefully, Melissa. Not every hill is worth dying on. He walked away without waiting for a response. The federal investigation became official in late March. 2 SEC enforcement attorneys arrived at Hartwell Capital's headquarters with subpoenas for financial records spanning 5 years. The company's general counsel met them in the lobby, flanked by a team of legal advisors I didn't even know existed. I watched from my desk as they walked past with uneasy solemnity. 34 people on our floor stopped typing at exactly the same moment, watching the attorneys disappear into the executive conference room. Someone coughed. No one spoke. The silence was deafening. Philip wasn't at his desk that day. His calendar showed back-to-back meetings, but his office light was off and his door was closed. Nina sat at her desk with the rigid posture of someone waiting for news she didn't want to hear. The compliance investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Federal investigators don't operate on corporate timelines, and they don't negotiate scope or access. Within 2 weeks, the SEC had subpoenaed 4 years of vendor records, expense reports, and approval chains. Every invoice I'd documented was now part of a federal evidence file. Philip's demeanor shifted during those weeks. The easy confidence that had defined him for as long as I'd known him started cracking at the edges. He arrived earlier and left later. He stopped eating lunch in the common areas. His conversations became shorter, his laughter forced, his attention scattered across too many concerns. I watched a man unravel in slow motion, and I was the only one who knew why. I watched the transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and guilt that I couldn't quite separate. This was the right thing. I knew it was the right thing, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different experiences entirely. Some days I felt like a hero, other days I felt like a traitor. Most days I felt both. The forensic accountants arrived in early April. 3 of them, specialists in financial crime investigation, who worked directly with the SEC Enforcement Division. They set up in a conference room on the 28th floor and began the methodical work of tracing every dollar that had flowed through Clearwater Advisory since its incorporation. I wasn't interviewed until the 2nd week of their investigation. A woman named Dr. Rachel Winters, senior forensic analyst, sat across from me in a small meeting room with the blinds drawn. She had a legal pad in front of her and a voice recorder running on the table between us. "Miss Blackwell," she began, "I understand you have some familiarity with the vendor relationships under review. I work in financial analysis. Vendor reconciliation is part of my regular responsibilities." She nodded, making a note. "And you were reassigned from budget reconciliation in January of this year. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Can you tell me why?" "I was told it was a reallocation of resources. Internal systems audit needed additional support." Dr. Winters looked up from her notepad. "And do you believe that was the actual reason?" The question hung in the air between us. I thought about Philip's warning in the break room. Choose your battles carefully. Not every hill is worth dying on. "I believe the timing was suspicious," I said. I had asked questions about a vendor the day before the reassignment came through. "Which vendor?" Clearwater Advisory. Dr. Winters wrote something on her pad without changing expression. And what questions had you asked? I told her everything. The missing deliverables, the identical invoices, the ghost meetings, the corporate registration linking Clearwater to Davenport Family Holdings. I told her about Nina's warning and Philip's veiled threat. I told her that the drive with copies of every document I'd been able to gather before my access was revoked was in my apartment. When I finished, Dr. Winters set down her pen and looked at me for a long moment. "You've been thorough," she said. "That helps." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "You should know that whistleblower identities are protected throughout the investigation process. Your name won't appear in any public filings or court documents unless you choose to make it known. I appreciate that." She gathered her papers and stood. "One more thing, Miss Blackwell. The amounts we've traced so far exceed $1.2 million over 4 years. This isn't a minor compliance violation. This is federal criminal fraud." "I understand." "Good. Because once charges are filed, things will move quickly. Be prepared for that." She left me alone in the conference room, with the echo of that number ringing in my ears. $1.2 million. More than I'd estimated, more than I'd imagined. Philip hadn't just been skimming. He'd been running a systematic embezzlement operation for years, confident that no one would ever look closely enough to notice. The criminal charges came in May, exactly as Dr. Winters had predicted. Wire fraud, securities fraud, tax evasion. Federal prosecutors described the case as textbook embezzlement executed by an executive who believed his position made him untouchable. I learned about the indictment from the news like everyone else. Philip had been arrested at his home in Connecticut early that morning, handcuffed in his driveway while his wife watched from the front door. The booking photo showed a man I barely recognized, his face gray and slack, his eyes empty of the confidence that had defined him for so long. The man in that photo was a stranger wearing a familiar face. His attorney released a statement denying all allegations and promising a vigorous defense at trial. The statement sounded confident and defiant. The booking photo told a different story entirely. The office atmosphere changed overnight. People who had admired Philip for years suddenly couldn't remember why. They seemed to be floating aimlessly in a void. I had passed that stage months ago. Those who had competed for his attention now competed to distance themselves from his legacy. Then the compliance team conducted interviews with everyone in his division, trying to determine who else might have known about the fraud and when they might have known it. I answered their questions honestly. No, I hadn't suspected anything before January. Yes, I had raised concerns about the vendor in question. No, I couldn't identify anyone else who had expressed similar concerns. The interviews lasted 3 days. I had lost all sense of direction and time. For the first time in my life, I had no idea or plan about my next step. I spent those nights staring at my ceiling, wondering if I had made the right choice. Nina was terminated the following week, not for complicity in the fraud, but for failing to report suspicious activity she had apparently been aware of for years. Her warning to me in the hallway made more sense now. She'd known. She'd known for a long time, and she'd chosen silence over consequence. I understood that choice, even if I couldn't respect it. After Philip's arrest, his office was cleared and sealed by the compliance team. His name was removed from the division masthead. His photograph disappeared from the leadership wall on the 28th floor. But the work continued. Deals were closed, reports were filed, budgets were reconciled. The machinery of the company ground forward as if nothing had happened, because for most people, nothing really had. Philip was a name on an indictment now, a cautionary tale in compliance training, a reminder that even trusted leaders could be hiding something behind their approachable smiles. I received a letter from the SECTS office of the whistleblower in late June, acknowledging my contribution to the investigation and outlining the potential award calculation. Based on the sanctions likely to be imposed, my share could exceed $150,000. The exact amount would depend on the final judgment and any restitution orders. This was a bigger amount than I had expected. I hadn't reported Philip for the reward. I'd reported him because the numbers told a story that someone needed to hear, and I was the only one willing to tell it. Philip's trial began in September and lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented a meticulous case built on the very documentation I had gathered. Invoices, approvals, corporate registrations, calendar entries. The evidence chain was unbroken, and the jury followed it to its inevitable conclusion: guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison the following month. The judge called his actions a systematic betrayal of trust that had consequences far beyond the dollar amounts involved. He ordered full restitution plus additional penalties that would likely follow Philip for the rest of his life. I didn't attend the sentencing. Despite everything, I didn't want to see him in an orange jumpsuit. The numbers had spoken, and the system had listened. That was enough. Some victories feel more like exhaustion than celebration. The company offered me a promotion after the trial concluded. Senior compliance analyst, reporting directly to the chief financial officer, with a significant salary increase and expanded responsibilities. They wanted to demonstrate that whistleblowing was valued, that doing the right thing had consequences beyond punishment for the wrongdoer. I turned it down. Not because I didn't want the recognition or the money. I turned it down because staying at Hartwell Capital meant staying as the person who always brought down Philip Davenport. I turned it down because I didn't want to remember those 7 years of memories every day for the rest of my life. I wanted to start fresh somewhere my identity wasn't defined by someone else's crime. I resigned from Hartwell Capital in December, nearly a year after I'd first discovered the discrepancies in the budget reconciliation reports. My exit interview was brief and professional. The HR director thanked me for my contributions and wished me well in my future endeavors. Neither of us mentioned Philip by name. The SEC Whistleblower Award was finalized in February of the following year, $187,000, representing 15% of the sanctions imposed on Philip and his associated entities. The check arrived by certified mail on a Thursday morning, delivered to the Chelsea apartment I'd moved into after leaving Tribeca. I deposited it without ceremony and used part of the funds to start my own forensic accounting consultancy. Small at first, just me and a laptop and a reputation that preceded me in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Word had spread through the financial community about what I'd done, and companies wanted to hire someone who had proven they could follow evidence wherever it led. The work found me. Compliance audits, fraud investigations, due diligence reviews for mergers and acquisitions. I built a client list of firms that wanted to catch problems before they became federal cases, and I built it on the foundation of one simple principle that Philip had taught me without ever meaning to. Numbers don't lie, and neither should the people who read them. Looking back now, I understand this. The choice to expose fraud isn't really about the fraudster at all. It's about deciding what kind of system you want to participate in and what kind of person you want to be. Do you agree? Share your thoughts in the comments. The full purple file playlist's waiting, or discover other color files for more office revenge. See you in the next file.